So when I look at Palm Sunday and we see this great celebration of Jesus coming into Jerusalem and everybody's so happy to see him, and I think, how in the world in basically 4 days, or 4 or 5 days, did all of these people turn on Jesus Christ? And this passage is a really good example of why. It's a rough sounding passage, and it is a really big warning. But I also think it's important to read it with the understanding of kind of the whole of Jesus' ministry, where he is going around offering healing, love, grace, and salvation, and yes, a major challenge to people. But it's not just you are all going to be crushed on the cornerstone. There is an invitation to a different way of life. And Jesus' message is one of redemption, hope, and forgiveness. And we get to that next Sunday, and I can't wait for that. And I also think it's important to say this owner of the vineyard, pretty nice person. These people who have been tenants of the owner are refusing to give the owner what is rightfully the owner's. They're basically saying that the vineyard's theirs. And instead of just starting eviction processes, getting the lawyers involved, the owner sends over a couple of messengers, more than one messenger, to say, hey, it's time to pay up. And when the people ridicule and reject them, the owner doesn't go to the cops, doesn't call in anybody other than the only son, the beloved son of the owner, and then these folks kill the son of the owner. Like this vineyard owner is a lot nicer than I would be in a similar situation. And I look at that and I remember that God is this great, loving, hope-filled God that has so much hope in us, even when we turn aside and say, this is our vineyard. I just have so much love and gratitude for God, even in a brutal passage. And this line that has just stuck with me through the week, which I'll get to even further a little bit later, but I want you to keep in mind is that stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the story, but show you how I see it in my own life. And I really do view the story as a message of warning, yes, but also of hope. Hope that we can do things a different way. Hope in the invitation that we can do things a different way. There was a few months ago, my wife and I were returning from Disney World, and we got to the airport, and we were about to fly home, and we walked in the airport, and there were more people in an airport than I've ever seen in my entire life. There was something weird going on. I looked up at this estimated wait time to get through the security checkpoint, and I think it said like 107 minutes to get through, and it was just chaos. And what I quickly learned was there had been a terrible tragedy at the checkpoint of the security checkpoint for the Orlando airport. Like something awful had happened. And because of that, they had to shut down the whole security checkpoint, and they also had to evacuate the entire terminal and get all of those people screened again to go through security. So there was a massive amount of people due to a really, really sad situation. And we were all kind of packed in as a big group together for a long time. Nobody in the airport had really prepared to facilitate something like this happening. So there's a lot of mistakes made by airport officials, and very quickly, people started screaming at airport officials, cutting in front of each other in line, screaming at each other, and even though we were all told we were all going to make our flights, there was nobody in the terminal to get onto a plane, and usually it is important to have passengers when a flight takes off. But all people could think about was, gosh, I am not getting what I want right now, and this is different, and I don't like it. And people's behavior can change severely, not only when a need is withheld, but when something they feel entitled to is withheld. We change. And I have this rule that I try and keep telling myself, you're never in too big of a hurry to be kind. You're never in too dire of a situation to be kind and compassionate towards one another. And I was doing a really good job of that, but we were about 6 people from the security checkpoint finally after about like 3 hours of waiting, and I got a text message from Southwest Airlines that said, your plane has departed. And I was so mad. I just kind of lost it for a second. I lost my poise. I was kind of looking at people around me angrily who hadn't done anything to me. And so I, who had just spent a week at Disney World, the happiest place on earth, who was at the worst case scenario going to get back to Nashville, Tennessee in like 4 or 5 hours instead of 2 or 3, was sitting there really upset because I wasn't getting my absolute way that I felt entitled to. So my behavior even changed because a part of all of us thinks this is my vineyard just a little bit more than it is the person next to me, or just actually a little bit more than it is God's. If I don't get what I'm entitled to, wow, what an injustice that we have. The people in this story who Jesus was talking to were used to treating the world like it was their vineyard. They'd become wealthy, and they'd gained a lot of standing in society, and they didn't want to give any of that up and felt that, gosh, if I give any of this up, well, I'm giving up what I earned, what I am entitled to. And even though probably a big portion of them were really, really well-meaning people who were really wanting to serve God, over time, while working in the vineyard, there was this shift that happened, and instead of working to make themselves closer to God's image, they kind of started working to make God closer and closer to their own image. And we get to this point where Jesus Christ himself, the Son of God, comes to them and challenges who they were and what they were doing. And instead of looking at that as, wow, we are violating something of God, a covenant that we'd made from God, they looked at a challenge to them as a challenge to God, because they had made God into their own image. It was an affront to God in their own eyes. And so they tossed out the cornerstone. They immediately take this moment where they realize, oh my gosh, Jesus is talking about us? Well, you know what? Let's kill him. That's what they wanted to do as soon as they found out. Thank you for laughing at that, Jessica. I think it's a ridiculous moment, but we have to be warned to ourselves that, gosh, when we get challenged, when we hear a really challenging word from the Bible or from faith or for someone who cares a lot about us, that is speaking to us the truth in love, that we don't make the same mistake. And the question has to be asked, why should we give it to God when we could just have all of it for ourselves? Why listen to that messenger telling us a hard truth when we could just dismiss them or kill them and just reap all the benefits of what we feel is rightfully ours? It's a real question. I mean, do we even need God? Do we even owe God anything? I mean, yeah, God planted the vineyard, but wow, we've been here working for a long time, and maybe we just deserve all of it. We've been tending to the vineyard for quite a while. I see that question, and I also start shifting my focus towards this thought that maybe giving something to God isn't a penance or a punishment or even something that deprives us of something, but is a different way of looking at the world that gives us more life than we could possibly imagine. And one of the reasons I look at this way is I have a friend who is the father of one of my best friends from growing up who taught me a big lesson on this one time. We were on a mission trip to Mexico with a bunch of youth, and there was a pretty high-stakes thing happening in the youth group, which I was trying to help address, which was they had this list of 8 great values that they were presented with earlier in the spring, the entire youth group at the church I grew up at. And these values were things like relationships, prosperity, safety, and one of the 8 great values was belief. And all of the kids were given a survey and just asked to anonymously say, which ones do you rank higher than the other ones? So they rated them, which ones are the most important. And out of the 8 great values, belief came in at number 8. Why do we even need belief in God? What does that do? And so I was tasked with developing a educational piece, a devotional piece for the trip to try and show where God is in each one of these values, and we decided to make belief the very last one. And somebody came up to me and said, Scott, for your belief passage, you need to talk to Douglas. Douglas has a story that talks about belief that you could really hear and everyone here could really hear. So I decided to take some time to meet with Douglas during the trip. So during lunch in Mexicali, Mexico, it was 105 degrees outside. It was a dry heat, but it's still pretty hot. I had arranged to meet him in between work sites, and I just saw Douglas kind of hunched over, looking down at this hill that he was standing on top of, and he kind of motioned over to me, like, kind of, don't show anybody that you're coming, but I really need you here. And I went up to him, he put his arm around me, and he said, Scott, I need you to go get my cane. I dropped my cane all the way down the hill. And Douglas could barely walk. And so I said, sure, I'll go and I'll get your cane for you. And so I got up and got his cane. We sat in his truck for a little while, and he just started bouncing questions off of me. I started bouncing questions off of his. And he said, yeah, I think I should really just talk about why I can't really walk so well. And then after thinking kind of frantically for a little while, I saw him just breathe, and he just wrote down one breath at a time. And he said, okay, I think I'm good. I think I'm good to go. So a few days later, the houses were built in Mexico, and we were in Santa Barbara, California on the beach. And we were with this big group of rambunctious teenagers, and it kind of started raining, and Douglas started telling his story. And I have never seen a group of teenagers and adults sit so still in the rain for about an hour. But I'm only going to tell you a little bit of what he said, but the most important thing for me from what he said. And what Douglas said was there was a time, and not too long ago, when he just thought that he didn't need God for anything. He'd conquered everything he had to conquer in life. He'd struggled with addiction to drugs and alcohol. He had conquered that. He had found a great job that paid really well with his abilities as a contractor. He had a great house in Los Altos, California, one of the most expensive areas of the country. He had a fantastic wife. He had a fantastic kid. He had it all figured out. He did not need God for anything. That's what he told everyone. And then one day, things kind of changed. He developed this thing called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a really rare disease in which your immune system starts attacking your nervous system. And it can be not super bad before it goes away, or it can be really life-threatening and even can cause a fatality. And Douglas had a really bad case of it. So he began getting paralyzed out of nowhere, and he was in the hospital for several months and had to use a ventilator to breathe. He was on life support. And when you're on a ventilator for multiple months, your body forgets how to breathe. And so it is really hard then to start breathing again, and they have to do this thing where they have to wean you off of the ventilator. So they take you off for a little bit, try and get you to breathe, let you rest, and then put the ventilator back in. And so finally Douglas, after a few months, was at the point where it was time to start trying to get him to breathe again. But every time he went off the ventilator, he would gasp breathlessly for air. So he would go, wouldn't be able to breathe, would panic, would have the ventilator put back in. And it kind of got to the point where after a few times, the doctors were saying, we don't know if you're going to be able to breathe again if you can't learn to breathe pretty quick. We're getting past the point of no return. Douglas didn't want to be on a ventilator his whole life, so it was getting to the point where he was going to have to make a decision to try to have the plug pulled if he couldn't breathe. It was a scary, scary moment. And knowing that he didn't want to be on a ventilator his whole life and knowing what the stakes were, Douglas suddenly found himself in prayer. And what the prayer was, God, wow, I thought I didn't need you my whole life, but looking back, I saw you, and when I was struggling with addiction, you were there, weren't you? And you were there in the great blessing that I got with my family, and you equipped me with so many great skills that let me get this great income and great job that I've had and this passion in my life. And I need you to know that I see that now, and I'm just going to go for this tomorrow. And since you've been there for me my whole life, I trust you that no matter what happens, if this goes in a good way or in a tough way, that you'll be there with me through it. and that you'll also be there taking care of my family just as you've taken care of me my whole life. I trust you. In a way, Douglas in that moment said, this is your vineyard, God, isn't it? I will give you what I can in gratitude because I know I'm living in your vineyard. The next day, they pulled out the ventilator. It was a big moment, and as soon as they pulled it out, Douglas went for it and breathed in air for the first time in months. And he said he didn't know what to do. So he asked, God, what do I do? And he felt something in him say, take another breath. So he took another breath in. And he said, God, what do I do? And he felt something say, take a break. And so they put the ventilator back in. And over the next few weeks, he was able to wean himself off of the ventilator. And when he got out of that time, he saw the world in a different way, and he devoted himself to service. You couldn't have a mission trip without him signing up for it. He wanted to serve out of gratitude. And, you know, I've worked in a children's hospital. I've seen some really rough stuff, and I know that there's very faithful people that this does not happen to. This miracle that everybody's been waiting for does not happen to. Not everybody gets that miracle breath that comes in. And it makes me wonder, what is the actual miracle in this story? Was it that a man who couldn't breathe was able to breathe again and that God just intervened? Was it that a man gave himself to God in such a way that gave him the courage that he needed to overcome this breathless situation of panic that kept him from breathing? Maybe, but there's one definite miracle that I see in this, and it's that through God's grace, a man who once thought he had no need for God, that saw his life in the vineyard he was working in as his own and his own only, came to see the world in a way that never before had he even imagined. And he focused not on the bitterness of having the use of, or most of the use of his legs taken away suddenly, but he focused on how he could leave, and he would say how he could live one breath at a time in gratitude and service to the true owner of the vineyard. That stone that Douglas, who is a builder, had rejected became his cornerstone. When I remember Douglas' story, I don't think of a man who finally paid up by giving himself to God, but a man who was set free by giving himself to God. And that's what this message is to me. Yes, it is a warning to all of us, but it's also an offer of freedom, of hope, of grace, of love, and yes, of life. And that's the good news we proclaim as Christians. That's the good news for both the rich and for the poor. What is the share of the produce that God asks of us, all of us, the tenants of God's vineyard? I think it's everything that we are. That's the share of the produce. It's devoting our work in the vineyard to loving the Lord with all our hearts, all our souls, all our strength, and all our minds, and loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. To seek justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with God. We are called to live lives of gratitude and service because it's a response for all that God gives to us. As a response to the simple miracle of being able to breathe in and breathe out. We respond to the miracle of being able to spend this moment in God's vineyard together by giving God all that we have to give of ourselves. We are called to give everything because God gives us more than we could possibly fathom. John Wesley had a prayer that spoke to this, and in closing, I'm going to read it to you. I am no longer my own, but thine. Put me to what thou wilt. Rank me with whom thou wilt. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed by thee or laid aside for thee. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and heartily yield all things to thy pleasure and disposal. And now, O glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thou art mine, and I am thine. So be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. This is your vineyard now and forever. Amen.